We cannot afford to slow down because the pace of urbanization, the pace of urban growth, the pace of urban change is so rapid that we cannot waste a moment. Moreover, this session is dealing with inclusion. It's dealing with how to include poor and disadvantaged people and how to do that in a system which we know is not as straightforward as planners around the world often assume. So what is a well-governed city? It's one where the rule of law is maintained, where critical public goods are equitably and efficiently provided, where economic regulation encourages growth and innovation, and citizens are able to take an active part in public decision-making. Now, while formal institutions of governance play a central role in ensuring such outcomes, what we're going to do in this session is consider the situations and the contexts in which this is not always the case, where a much broader range of non-governmental actors, where the political parties, commercial associations, community-based organizations, religious organizations, and so on, engage. Secondly, we have to recognize in this session, I think, that in the absence of government efforts to plan and manage rapidly changing urban settlements, whether this is because they're unable to or unwilling to, a variety of hybrid governance arrangements emerge to fill the gap, to fill the vacuum. We see this in informal land markets, we see this in community policing, we see this in the rise of urban mafia, we see this in all sorts of arenas. And sometimes we also recognize that these informal arrangements are embedded within formal institutions and structures. So we have a kaleidoscope of overlapping policing and policies and legal and illegal, partisan and fair mechanisms of urban governance, and that's what we're going to address today. This morning, the Minister Clark spoke about things like livability. The informality that I've just described makes cities livable for many people. It makes them bearable for many people, but it also makes them unbearable for others. Unbearable for the fiscus when they aren't able to collect taxes, unbearable for all city dwellers who don't benefit from urban services. So in dealing with inclusive urban governance, as we are in this session, the focus is to acknowledge that we're not dealing with the tabula rasa, but need to work through this hybrid environment of urban governance. In doing so, we're going to mirror, if you like, in this session, the informality that we're talking about in the cities around us. We're not going to get up to the podium, we're going to talk from the table. This is going to take the form of presentations, but in the form of a fireside chat. I think we represent as a panel something of the diversity of our cities, perhaps for the first time today, both generationally and in terms of gender, whilst still having the wisdom of older people like Mr. Roy and myself. So I think we have a very diverse and interesting afternoon ahead, and I'm now going to hand over to my co-chair, who will introduce the speakers.
Thank you, Jo. I'm Mukulika Banerjee. I will not make further remarks, except to urge those on Twitter to provide your reports to those who've been talking about the gender imbalance. Shame on them if they thought LSE cities would organize an event without a proper gender balance. So here it is, you just had to wait for it. Our first speaker, who will speak from the podium, is Abhijit Banerjee, Professor of Economics at MIT, speaking on understanding the choices of the urban poor. Yeah.
I have 10 minutes, and I spent 40 seconds of that walking up here, so I better rush. So I think this is something that I've spent many years wondering about, which is how do we get in India at least, we have a very vibrant political system, always in the press, always there's always action that people are talking about. It certainly seems democratic. Why don't we get better urban political outcomes and rural, for that matter, for the poor in particular? And I think there's a bunch of stories that people tell. One is that people keep moving, so they're not really invested in the urban neighborhoods. Second is maybe it's just my judgment that these conditions are not great. People are not unhappy enough to act on them. Maybe people just have too many different kinds of constituencies. People don't agree on what's the priority. Maybe it's the case that politicians can't influence them, so they can't do very much. Maybe people don't care about political performance in the appropriate way. Maybe they just don't know about it, or maybe politicians don't know about it. And so in some sense, what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to pull together evidence from a body of work I've been doing for many years now. It's at least 7, but really longer than that. This is mostly, but not entirely, based on a survey we did in Delhi. We've done kind of 3 different or 5 different surveys, but huge for 102 wards in Delhi, which was chosen at random, and from there we did about 5,500 households. So I think the first thing that is striking so this is for the low-income neighborhoods entirely. So these are surveys of what would be called slums, but I don't know exactly how, but using various definitions, which I don't have time to tell you about. First thing is that it's settled. A fact that's very striking is the number of years you stayed in that neighborhood is 17 years, the median person. So these are not itinerants. They're not moving from place to place. This is the second is that I think if you objectively, the infrastructure is bad. I'll show you some, maybe more graphic. So this is the toilets. 2/3 of the population uses these kinds of toilets. Most of these toilets have fecal matter in them at the point where we went and checked, and we've done many, many checks of them. And this is correspondingly how many have taps, mostly none. This is what garbage looks like in the slums. Informal piles dominate. Those 2 columns were kind of put up to sort of emphasize that fact. They really dominate. And people do complain all the time. If you ask them what their biggest problems are, they complain. So you get water, sewer, and garbage are the 3 biggest things people complain about, despite the politicization of electricity in Delhi. It's not a complaint that you get very often. When we ask the RWA, which is sort of the rest of the ward, meaning the middle class, you get a somewhat different picture. In particular, garbage removal works much better for the middle classes, and so priorities shift to other things. So I think the one thing that's clearly different is that. Now, to say that, politicians, as I said, one hypothesis, politicians can't do very much about it. Now, I think there's one place where they clearly can do something, and which is each of them gets 50 million rupees a year to spend on whatever they want to spend it on. What do they spend it on? Roads. Notice that roads did not come up in that list of things I showed you. That is not a priority for anybody, but now people do. It's not this. The reason why you're getting these outcomes is not because people don't participate in electoral politics. Most people vote. Many people have many more people than people in this room would have participated in a march, attended an event. I have not participated in a march since I was a student, I think, but I think most of these people do. They have transactions with politicians. They've attacked, a quarter have attended a speech or a rally, which is an extremely high number, especially relative to Indian middle classes, and so on. So they participate. I should just go, say one more thing, which is that they actually do they do actually approach public officials. A very large fraction of them, I think, like again a quarter. I can't see the number from here, but I think a quarter have approached the MLA, and another quarter have approached the councillor. So people have actually gone to politicians. It's much more than any middle-class person would have. This is very striking, is that they do engage with the political system. I should say one more thing, which I should have said, and there should have been, when I was talking about what do people complain about? Everybody complains in the same area about the same thing. So if you take the area and predict what would people complain about, if A complains about garbage, B complains about garbage. So there's the idea that this is because people have multiple demands and they're inconsistent with each other is just not true. People have very homogeneous demands. At least the poor people have very homogeneous demands. They don't get it. Now, let me just, sorry, I think I skipped one slide. And now yeah. If you approach a public official, you often, I mean, the median thing that happens is nothing. You know, there is some things do happen sometimes, but the median thing that happens is nothing. And nothing takes two forms. One is you go and he says, I'll do something. The other is that he doesn't talk to you. And they're about equally likely. Now, do voters know enough to get what they want? So maybe politicians often tell them, and this is absolutely true, they tell them both what powers about things they can do and can't do, and both of them are false. So many of them we have much evidence of people saying, we can't do anything about garbage, that's the responsibility of X. And it turns out that X is you. So that's very common. The opposite is also common. People often claim that, you know, your slum will be demolished unless you vote for me. And often it turns out that the slum was not on any list to be. When you go and check what list they were on, so they both claim things they can do and can't do, and both tend to be not. So there is some prima facie evidence of it. People don't know the MLA's name, but I don't think that's a big issue. They know who he is. He's the BJP guy or the Congress guy or something. What they don't know, for example, are key. So there are two schemes we asked them about, three schemes, but I'll tell you about two because I don't have time. One is how much money does a councillor or a MLA get to spend on the constituency? The amount they underestimate by a massive amount. So they think he has, you know, few lakhs, you know, maybe less than $1 million, and in fact he has more like 50 million. So that's one thing they don't know. The second is the EWS, which is the scheme that allows every low-income parent to apply for seats in elite private schools or in private schools in general, and 4% of the population know about this scheme. So things that are very relevant to them, they actually don't know. So and if you look at what happens is if you actually publish report cards, you do get an impact. So it does change voting. If you publish more report cards and you deliver report cards to the neighborhoods, they say, yes, okay, we won't vote for this guy who spent all his money on decorative lights. However, where I'm stuck at this point is that we did one last thing, which we told politicians that we'll publish report cards on you. And we were expecting, we told this 2 years before that, then we went and told them about the toilets in the neighborhoods, which one are working, which one are not working, so they knew exactly which toilets were not working. We gave them a catalog of these things. This was just before the elections. We gave them all the information. We told them that if you don't do it, we'll write about it. It had zero effect. So except one thing it did, they shut down some toilets. That's the only thing they did. So where I stand is I absolutely don't understand why politicians, or I have guesses, but I can't prove them, why politicians are unresponsive to incentives. My depressing theory is that the whole system is now entirely based on the assumption that nobody is going to get re-elected, or most people are not going to get re-elected in the same constituency. So parties move people around all the time to avoid having, so basically you go in there, you make money, you move to the next constituency, or you go. And since it says stop there, I think I'm supposed to stop. Thank you.
Next on is Sue Parnell, Professor, African Center for Cities.
So, Joe, we have technological lock-in, do we? So where we speak from here. There should be some slides, which is why I'm at the podium. Ah, great. Just first of all, a word of caution. I'm speaking about a continent, so there are going to be some generalizations. We know quite a lot about Nairobi's government. In 1941. It was a relatively small town, it was run for a very particular constituency, and its governance regime was pretty largely imported. Nearly 70 years later, we still know quite a lot about Nairobi's government. It's a relatively well-documented city. We know that many aspects of the governance arrangements don't work very well. We know that the revenue streams don't manage to meet everybody, and we know that the legal codes are inappropriate, both at the top end and the bottom end. We know that the city's not working, and we also know that if we were to project what we want for Nairobi in 70 years' time, we probably wouldn't choose these governance and government regulations, forms, size and shape of the civil service. Part of what I want to suggest to you today is that the moment of decolonization created an opportunity for African cities to rework government. And that was done in some very profound kinds of ways, including extending the vote to everybody. And that's a very, very significant thing. And as a South African, I think we underestimate that at our peril. However, it seems to me that what we are on the cusp of, as we begin to think of an urban age in the African context, is the opportunity to rework government in important kinds of ways. But we shy away from that, partly because we think government is very boring and not very politically correct. And it's very important for us to just clear out some of the reasons why we shy away from, in a sense, the elephant in the room. And I think the first one, at least I've always said that it was because people focused on neoliberalism and the opportunities for privatization, so either the critique of neoliberalism or the attempt to seek out gains from private opportunities. I'm a little anxious that the current discussion about smart cities does exactly the same, but it's one reason that detracts from a discussion about appropriate government and government regimes. Second reason, it seems to me, is that we don't talk about government is because governments everywhere lack legitimacy. And that's particularly true at the local scale. And that's every survey you see from every country, everywhere in the world, and is true of Africa as well. The final reason why we don't talk about government, in the African context in particular, is that there's been a very heavy push over the last 20 years for participatory modes, for inclusion of non-state actors in governance regimes. And so we really have had the tyranny of governance. And it seems to me we need to be able to get over ourselves, not to forego the gains from those initiatives, but to refocus on the opportunities which are before us as we move into this really critical moment of city building in the African context. Now, when we start to look at the African urban context, what we discover is that central governments, which we could spend a lot of time talking about, and I hope Mr. Gordon will pick up on this in tomorrow's panel, either have been very anti-urban, in other words, their policies, as in the case of India, have not been designed to deliver to an urban constituency, as we heard earlier, or governments are uncertain about what to do that will work well for cities. And that might be quite sectoral, you know, water, energy, a whole lot of really technical dimensions of what it is that government does. If we look at the African context, though, and we look at the question of local government, that devolution question that we were talking about earlier, this is not the debate you were having between Germany and America and even the UK, a notoriously centralized system. If we look in the African context, what we see is that local government, municipalities, almost always fail to have full jurisdiction over the peri-urban settlements, either because they haven't been incorporated into the boundaries, in other words, they are technically rural, or because they've been incorporated, but they continue to be run on an alternative regime of rule, in other words, the rule which is held and the power that is held by traditional authorities. So competing kinds of rationalities of government which take place in those places. So that's one reason why it's very difficult to address the question of urban government, and it's an imperative for us to begin to start reforming it. The second is that these very fragile institutions of municipalities have to compete with extremely powerful institutions of banks, of traditional authorities, of gangs, of a whole series of people who are making claim to the city as a site of accumulation. Okay? And so it's not just that they are not robust themselves, but they have to fight very, very large and powerful players, some of whom are not even on site. In other words, they're not even in the country. And then the third thing, which I think is extremely difficult in the government debate around African cities, is that municipalities lack revenue. Now, there's a whole discussion which plays out everywhere about, you know, what local powers do you have for taxation? And it's a very important question. Do you collect rates from everybody or not? And if not, why not? It's a much bigger question. When poor countries simply don't have the kind of money that they require to invest to meet the expectations of their citizens. And so government has been a very difficult question for us to talk about. But it seems to me we need to begin to start doing it. And there's an opportunity to do that, partly because thankfully the question of the state is back on the political agenda. It's back on the political agenda both intellectually and politically. And this is the moment before we begin to extend, improve, reform our urban spaces to meet our global challenges, that we look at how we govern our cities. And by that I don't simply mean that political system of your electoral system that you adopt. I mean those technical questions. What's your fiscal system? What's your land use system? What's your arrangement of the size and shape of the civil service? Those really big questions there. And it's a really important thing, and those on the screen are a number of the reasons that we have before us. And perhaps some of the most important of those take us to the question of what reinserting the state does to the broader question of urban politics. And I think that was raised much earlier, is this relationship between how the state operates and what the nature of politics is that we want to concentrate on. And it seems to me that the first thing that looking at how, and perhaps who, reforms government is a question about how political parties operate. It won't be done without support of the leading political parties. We've got to look at how parties run, how they're funded, what their interests are, what the disincentives are. Otherwise, we're not going to understand corruption, and we're not going to understand the technicalities of the government regimes we're putting in place. The second thing is we absolutely have to confront this extremely difficult question of the democratic process. And it's a very fragile process. If you've been watching what's going on in Cairo and any number of other cities, you will know that we cannot assume the relationship between democracy and our cities of the future. And that complicated question of how we manage what we expect from, I think was the spin put on it. What do you expect from your democratic institutions? And what do you expect from them at the city scale? In the African context, it is not possible to talk about government without talking about the things that government has no control over. And that means that we have to confront two really significant issues. One is the question of traditional power. the power of the chiefs. The second thing that we have to do is we have to confront the question of so-called informality, the stuff that lies beyond the state, or at least ostensibly lies beyond the state. And then finally, and for me this is probably a really important one, and I suppose this makes me a bit of a techie nerd, and this is probably not the kind of room and forum within which to be having this discussion. We have to go back to basics about how we design, how we build, how we manage, and how we begin to enforce the kinds of regulatory regimes, by which I mean the legal codes, the building codes, the tax code, whether or not you are able to behave in certain kinds of ways in the city. And those kinds of nuts and bolts are absolutely critical. And so in conclusion, I want to take you to my own city of Cape Town, which I think these are very contemporary photographs, tell us a lot about government. And it reminds us, the photograph on the right is of a place called District 6, where there was a forced removal of people from an inner city location by a government that had power and executed it illegitimately. On the left is a neighborhood very close to where I live, where we have single-handedly failed to address both environmental concerns and the social concerns and aspirations of local communities because the regulatory regime has failed in very significant kinds of ways. So whether it's the politics of control, the politics of ineptitude, designing our governance systems is absolutely crucial for Africa's urban future.
Next on is Austin Zeideman, Assistant Professor of Urban Geography at LSE.
Good afternoon, everyone. For the past 2 years, a small group of us has been working on the Urban Uncertainty Project at LSE Cities. The group has been made up of myself, Jonathan Silver, Sobia Cocker, and Astrid Wood. We've been asking and answering a rather unusual question. How do uncertainties about the future shape the cities of the present, and what does this mean for urban governance? It's lamentably easy to cite recent examples for why such a pursuit is now more urgent than ever. Amidst heightened global anxiety about things like climate change, financial crisis, political violence, and disease outbreak, responding to different forms of uncertainty has become a preeminent governmental imperative. The work of governing cities is oriented, perhaps now more than ever, towards speculating on possible futures, anticipating potential events, and experimenting with techniques for managing the unknown. The goal of our research has been to assess how this imperative is shaping 21st century cities and urban life. We conducted fieldwork in 6 cities across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. In each city, we focused on a different form of uncertainty and its implications for urban governance. However, our approach to urban governance looked far beyond the role of the state, focusing on civil society and the private sector, as well as less obvious, but perhaps equally important, actors, from social media networks to paramilitary armies to alternative energy providers. Our methods were ethnographic in nature, though they were not always focused on the local. We traversed various sites and scales to get to grips with the distributed networks that both produce and respond to uncertainty within and beyond each city. Our comparative approach allowed us to remain grounded in the specific context of each place, revealing parallels as well as disjunctures across our respective field sites. In the interest of time, I'll just discuss 3 of our cases and then highlight some of the key findings. In Accra, Jonathan Silver concentrated on crises within the energy networks that supply the city. The causes of infrastructural uncertainty in Accra were multiple, as were the strategies people used to manage it. Residents of low-income networked neighborhoods did not simply cope with the city's unpredictable energyscape. They sought out collaborative possibilities at various points of intersection across and beyond infrastructural systems. Through intersections of people and infrastructure, of people as infrastructure, residents actively reshaped the electricity network and incrementally experimented with ways to address energy insecurity and the uncertainty of daily life across the grid. But given the fragmented socio and political and spatial landscape of Accra, Silver observed that responses to energy crisis followed lines of class, power, and access. A boom in middle-class urbanization was visible, as energy-intensive concrete suburbias relied on generator technologies to insulate themselves from disruption. Real estate developers marketed infrastructural security and premium network spaces that offered, to those who could afford it, life without interruption through off-grid electricity generation technologies. What emerged was the realization that uncertainty is both produced and productive, produced by metabolic infrastructural processes within and beyond Accra, and productive of new social relations and economic opportunities, which sought not to control uncertainty but to capitalize upon it. In Karachi, Sobia Kakar focused on a securitized housing complex run by the military. She found that residents were drawn to such enclaves for their promise of reducing the uncertainties of everyday life in a conflict-ridden city prone to outbursts of violence and infrastructural breakdown. But rather than trusting the government to provide security, people in Karachi created alternative governance systems, from resident committees and community associations to armed gangs and local militias. Uncertainty produced new political alliances and allegiances amongst and between formal and informal governance institutions for managing potential crisis. However, she found also that the conditions of certainty promised by new spatial and political strategies generated further uncertainty beyond their borders, and that living inside one did not necessarily make people feel safe. This led her to track the circulation of security information among residents and its effect on how they understood and navigated the city. The sources of information she examined first were government agencies and security agencies and the news media. But social media and other unofficial networks of information sharing were far more influential in shaping residents' sense of what and where and who was dangerous. Uncertainty again emerged as something both produced and productive, produced by histories of violence and instability, and productive of new political coalitions, spatial formations, governance arrangements, and information circuits, which themselves created their own new forms of uncertainty. I've been focusing on the port city of Buenaventura on Colombia's Pacific coast, which now moves a greater volume of merchandise than anywhere else in the country and is regarded as the linchpin of Colombia's economic future. Vast amounts of public and private capital from around the world are being funneled into infrastructure megaprojects to accommodate but also to entice increasing commerce passing through the bay. This scenario hinges on speculative projections and the management of related forms of uncertainty. As Colombia's only Pacific Ocean port, Buenaventura's goal of becoming a world-class port city is tied to the projection of booming trade relations with China and the advent of the Asian century. However, even the World Bank and the Chinese government's own economic advisory body have admitted that China's continued rise to global dominance is also uncertain. Meanwhile, projections of sea level rise and increased flood risk suggest that Buenaventura is particularly vulnerable. Climate change is real, but there's serious uncertainty about the local effects of it. And yet the government plans to relocate waterfront settlements and dredge the shipping canal. Both adaptation measures have the added benefit, you might call it the end goal, of facilitating the official vision of port expansion. But uncertainty also, Buenaventura has also been ravaged by paramilitary groups fighting over strategically important waterfront territories. Much of the city is still controlled by these groups who use gruesome violence to maintain the population in a constant state of uncertainty and to weaken the resolve of those opposing drug trafficking and port expansion. Now, these multiple forms of uncertainty, economic, ecological, existential, are not somehow antagonistic to governance, but rather facilitate an official vision of port development and urban development more broadly. But uncertainty also motivates alternative plans drawn up by architects and urban designers allied with local social movements. These proposals are based on settlement patterns, construction techniques, and livelihood strategies uniquely adapted to the uncertain social and environmental conditions of the Pacific Coast. Now, the 6 cities in which we worked reveal differences in how uncertainty shapes contemporary urbanism. But there were also parallels between our cases that transcended the particularity of each one. We found that uncertainty was not a generalized, evenly distributed urban condition, as all the cities in which we worked were deeply divided. Differently empowered urban actors and institutions with widely divergent resources mobilized different tactics and techniques in response to different forms of uncertainty. That said, uncertainty sometimes crossed social, spatial, and political divides, uniting actors around a common problem or in pursuit of similar objectives. We found it to be a terrain of political possibility, a domain of governmental intervention, and a field of creative collaboration. Our research also demonstrated that uncertainty transected multiple sites and scales. It may be tempting to locate it solely within everyday struggles for survival among the urban poor, but it's equally possible to see it as a problem for urban policy, governance, and the state. Uncertainty may be contained within spatial or institutional boundaries, or it may transgress them. This suggests that techniques for governing uncertainty, such as scenario planning, risk management, preparedness, and so on, often reduce one form of uncertainty while increasing others. All our cases involve practices of searching for ways to deal with the unpredictable dimensions of urban existence, whether by government officials, planners, or members of the urban poor. However, even in cases where solutions were found, there was rarely a final resolution or a fixed point of closure. Uncertainty was hardly ever eradicated, but rather managed, displaced, or deferred. The phrase governing through uncertainty highlights the fact that the work of governance is not paralyzed by that which cannot be calculated, predicted, or known. Now, if uncertainty stimulates governance, it also generates opportunities for profit. Just as financial derivatives capitalize on contingency, fluidity, and unpredictability, uncertainty in an urban context is actively being converted into a form of value, commodified and exchanged. But if uncertainty can be a logic of accumulation, it can also be a logic of distribution. It cuts both ways. The message for urban governance is that uncertainty cannot be solved as a technical problem, but nor can responsibility for it be devolved to individuals, communities, or other local actors and institutions. There's a pressing need to develop a progressive politics of uncertainty, since it may well be a key feature of urbanization for the foreseeable future. Thank you very much.
Thank you to our 3 speakers, and I'm now going to ask our panelists to very briefly say a few words in response to what they've heard, no more than 5 minutes maximum. Can I start with you, Mr. Roy?
Well, I have 3 points, but since Mukulika, in spite of my obvious wisdom, has threatened me with dire consequences if I speak too long, I'll just raise the first one, which is, Joe, you kind of played out what the city should be. It's an inclusive vision, that this is what the city means, or should mean. But what I hear from the 3 speakers is something quite different. And if it is something quite different, is it possible, and this I'm asking as a question to all of us, is it possible to change the definition of the city itself, which is the city as a center of growth, as an engine of growth? This is widely recognized. But center of growth of what? And what the 3 speakers seem to suggest is that it is actually a center for accumulation. It's a center for extraction. And if the political leader is essentially interested in maximizing their take, if the corporates in Buena Veneta are essentially interested in maximizing their profits, and if, as Susan says, the state is clearly linked up with corporates, developers, financiers, then are we not looking at the city as extractive, therefore by definition exclusionary, and would did not make much more sense, therefore, not to talk of, as you put it, uncertainty, but that it is a certainty that these cities are going to extract and exploit. And this is what is being planned for. And any counter plan would therefore have to take that into account and say how to stop that extraction and accumulation.
Thank you very much. And now could I ask Adam for you to say a few words, your perspectives?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've already thankfully dealt with one of the elephants in the room, which was the question of gender representation. But for me, and from where I sit, there's another elephant in the room, which is the question of technology, and which we've barely touched upon at all, except by laminating it into the idea of the smart city, which, as many of you know, is something that I'm not particularly fond of. I just want to take a couple of seconds to consider the question of big data, smart cities, and what they might mean in the Indian context, along with their polar opposite, participatory technology. I do want to consider the place of an apparently autonomous technology to condition not merely the prospects for urban self-determination, but indeed the conditions of everyday life itself. And in this consideration, I want to assert that the point of big data, the point of the smart city rhetoric and paradigm is precisely to manage and bracket urban uncertainty. It's precisely to predict, to anticipate, and to preempt events that might be untoward from the perspective of urban administrators. And in this, the technology of government that Foucault calls security is, I think, the technology of our time. It's essentially a statistical process. Foucault would assert that it's materially uninterested in individual behavior, only that at the level of populations. What big data allows us to do, however, at the first blush, big data would seem to correspond to this Foucauldian perception of security, but big data actually allows us to reach in to the population, to separate individuals. What the data capture apparatus allows the administrator of the city to do is have their cake and eat it too, both to aggregate information and treat it at the level of populations, but to break out individuals as biometrically anchored bodies and bring power to bear on them. And I find that to be something that is worthy at least of consideration and identification in any discussion of the smart city. I'm also particularly interested in discussing the role of participation technology in handling the fortunes of the urban poor, and understanding the choices of the unemployed is a great way to think about this. The great British cyberneticist Stafford Beer once said, discussing complex systems, that the purpose of a system is what it does. If a complex system is allowed to endure over any particular period of time, in fact, it must be functional. It must be doing something for somebody. And I would suggest that if the status quo has been allowed to persist for as long as it has, it must be indeed functional for slum dwellers, but also for other institutions that are benefiting from the status quo, and very much including individuals that are benefiting from the status quo. And I would like to suggest to you that the smart city is merely more of the same, except this time it benefits one of those parties differentially to the exclusion of the other. I would ask that we stop inflicting technology on the poor, stop lining the pockets of multinationals, and instead leverage the potential of the technology that poor people already have a meaningful grasp on, which is the mobile phone, and increasingly the smartphone, to allow them to institute networks of self-care and also underwrite demands on the state, as with the self-mapping project of Transparent Chennai. As Sue points out, the pitfall laying in wait here is responsibilization, is absolving the state of its formal responsibility of its citizens. But I think that I can see looming in the mist the contours of a more appealing vision that synthesizes many of the things we've been discussing today. The hybrid, middle-out state, responsible to its citizens via the linkages and couplings of a horizontal and distributed technology, and producing a security not on the terms of local elites or global investors, but on the terms of the people themselves. I think we can have it if we want it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam. And Tikender, could you give your perspective?
Just point a finger, Mukulika, never trust a politician. I mean, with such a beautiful audience and such a good mic. Huh? So just point a finger, when I cross my limit. Huh? Let me start from where Casey left in the morning. And when he was speaking, I'm one of those fastly extincting species, the first and the last directly elected deputy mayor of the town. since none of the presentations they were mainly general and none pertain to India, so let me make some observations and some specific instances and then two generalizations. Actually, my daughter always asked me, this was when I got elected 2 years ago, Papa, what do you do? I said, I've been told that you're the city father. I said, yeah. So what do you do? Can you handle some of the problems? I said, yeah. She gave me two problems. One was related to transport. Another one was related to some crime, something that happened. And I couldn't resolve any of those. Then she said, Papa, just tell me, what do you do? I said, I am the first garbage man of the city. And that's a function in this country which is universal. Handling garbage, because when we speak about India and when you speak about handling the urban affairs and all issues of inclusive growth, one thing is universal, and thanks to the intervention of the Supreme Court, and that, in this famous Surat case, when we had plague, the Supreme Court, hey, what is happening in this country? At least manage your garbage properly. And it was that garbage management is universally with the local bodies. Now, why do I point this out? For the simple reason that we have had this 74th Constitutional Amendment. Maybe someone coming from Europe would not be able to understand that. We have this 74th Constitutional Amendment which says that, look, these functions are to be handed over to the local bodies. And why I'm pointing out, because there is a strong relationship between the whole concept of inclusive growth and the whole concept of devolution of powers. Maybe some may not agree with me on that. And then we have the 12th schedule that keeps some 18 items that, look, these have to be transferred. So the point is, who runs the city? Who runs the government? And there may be divergent views, and every city has to be viewed very objectively. But I think there is a very strong dialectics between running the government and devolving the powers, for the simple reason, because who is the person who's first to be reported, be it disaster management, be it city resilience, or something of that sort. And let me share a very small anecdote here. You see, the town from where I come is a hilly town, and we have lots of snow. Come winters, and we have lots of snow. And when it snows, we have a large chunk of trees falling, and because we have those wires overhead, and so at times there's no electricity. So I remember a call getting from one of the localities by an old man. He said, look, my electricity is not there. And as I told you, because I'm the garbage man, electricity is being taken care by some parastatal organization. And I said, I'll just find out. I just got to the engineer. I said, how many days it will take? So he said, maybe 4 days, because 100 trees fell, and so lots of poles have been uprooted. So, and after 3 days, again I got a call. He said, the electricity has not been restored. I got back to the engineer. I asked him, yeah, you said in 3 days' time, 4 days' time, you'll restore it. And then I went back to him. I said, just give me one more day. Another 4th day also, electricity was not restored. Then I tried to explain to him, sir, this is not my domain. There is a parastatal organization that runs the electricity department, not mine. So try to understand. Do you know the answer that he gave me? He says, I have not voted for the electricity department. I have voted for you. I think that is something very important, very essential. When I heard Professor Casey in the morning, that the demand side is, I don't think the demand side is restricted. People give their mandate, and they give the mandate during the elections. So that's one part I wanted to make, and just raise the finger if I have. The second part, I think, is the whole concept of governance, which means inclusive governance. And with the new neoliberal paradigm that we are experiencing in this country, right from the top, because I'm running a city government, I know we have a central government which says, look, you'll get a matching grant. And what does a matching grant mean? It means that you have to generate your own resources, come what may, and then a matching grant would flow from the center. It's not that the people are not contributing. In 1880, per capita tax contribution of Shimla citizens was 18 rupees, 1880. And now it's more than 7,000 rupees per capita tax contribution. And that's just municipal tax. Forget about your income tax and all. So you know how the tax mechanism works in this country. And then they say, look, you have user charges on toilets, you have user charges on water. I'm selling the heavy, I'm buying water for 60 rupees a kiloliter, and I'm distributing at 8 rupees a kiloliter. It's a mismatch, but then I cannot go beyond that. So that's something. So this whole concept of neoliberalism that, look, whatever you do, you have to get it back from the people. I think this is one of the unsustainability of the systems that is moving, and this is the primary contradiction. The primary contradiction where, because you have a rising middle class, where you have the rising aspirations of the people, and at the same time you have the non-deliverance of the elected people. I've told you how the municipal corporations work, and at the same time, because 85% of your budget is what? It's a non-planned budget. You spend that budget on your salaries, you spend so I think the whole question of inclusive growth with a new liberal paradigm is just impossible. Now, how do we meet it? Therefore, the issue of strengthening the city governments. Of course, you will have city governments which would be facilitators for neoliberalism, but you'll also have city governments which would confront neoliberalism and would try to move in a direction where you are able to deliver, where you're able to have some kind of inclusive growth. And rest, I'll come to it a little later. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Tikenda. And I think let's give all our panelists a round of applause. And now let's open it up for a more informal discussion. And I think, Tikenda, you ended on the issue of class, really, and the demands of the middle classes and how they are being privileged, perhaps over those of the urban poor. And that takes us very nicely back to Austin's opening presentation, where you asked the question why politicians don't respond to demands of the urban poor, and posited quite a grim, pessimistic picture of the urban poor not either caring or wanting or being heard. So can you say something about that in relation to what you've heard from Tikenda and other speakers? I mean, this session is in part about agency, and yet I'm not seeing very much at all that's optimistic about the agency of the urban poor.
Sure, thank you. Okay. Okay, is that good? Yeah, I think that works. In some sense, I think that question might be a good one for Professor Banerjee to respond to, but I would like to take the opportunity to sort of respond to it in terms of inclusion, and that the issue of inclusive growth as being a kind of political imperative, a kind of governmental norm that seems to be hovering over the conversation. So inclusion, first of all, can be thought of in a political sense. It can then also be thought of in an economic sense. And I think the question here is really in what sense we're talking about inclusion and on what terms, especially in a context in which I know many of us work, where jobs in the formal sector are hard to imagine for a vast number of the urban population. So with a certain kind of idea of inclusion as a kind of economic endpoint, it seems a bit hard to imagine that sort of narrative. And so then it comes back to, in some sense, to Sue's focus on the state and in what sense we need to think about other forms of inclusion that have not to do with simply the right to have a job in the formal sector, even if that right is possibly achievable, but rather the right to actually participate in the production of the urban, as well as to perhaps receive the basic necessities through forms of distribution that ultimately allow for the living of a decent urban life.
Well, I was going to pose a question really to a conversation. There's one set of issues, there are many issues we can discuss, but there is an issue of government and governance, what Casey said before, and about the 74th Amendment, and your role as an elected politician, and what Abhijit was saying about what voters do in terms of engagement with politicians. There might be a lack of information, but I wonder whether one of the failures, as Casey said, about the why it hasn't worked the way it was envisaged, is actually there's a lack of information for elected representatives themselves. You know, do you know what you have jurisdiction over? Can you have the electricity fixed? It took him 4 days to tell you that electricity is not something that he can, it's not in his jurisdiction. So is that the kind of knowledge you need when you take up a post?
I think we are still in that evolutionary phase of urbanization, and how do we manage our urban affairs? Why I say so? Because we are one of the oldest municipalities of the country. It dates back to 1851. You know, my city happened to be the erstwhile British capital of colonial India. I mean, it ruled half of this from Eden to Auckland. It was ruled from the building where I sit now. So I think we are still in that evolutionary phase, and when things were pointed out in the morning, that when the whole policy paradigm shift took place immediately after independence, look what Gandhiji said, India lives in villages. So urbanization, it's a dialectical process, I would say. It's not, yes, it is part of that, where the urban bodies, but they're demanding now. I can assure you we have an organization of all the elected mayors, deputy mayors, and what we call the city presidents, where it is being demanded that, look, what we require is more financial sustainability.
Who's making the demands? Are the people?
Yeah, the elected people. Of course, the elected people. That's one part. The other part is, come what may, people realize that they have an elected councillor.
Yeah.
And it is he, because I can tell you, the population of the city is around 200,000. 100,000 every day move in, move out. I know more than 15,000 by their names. So that's how. I mean, because it's a small town. So people are demanding. It's not that people are not demanding. So the whole point is how that has to be taken care of. What is the alternate? And do we require some other parastatal organization? So there where I always, I always fight for it, what we heard in the morning, that you have to fight for your right. That you have to strengthen the local bodies. You have to strengthen the governance within the local bodies, and you have to decentralize it, and one of the forms which we are experimenting it, which is being experimented nowhere in the country, is how it's not financial sustainability of the municipal corporation at the city level, but also at the ward level. So what we are doing is that 10% of the total revenue collected in the form of taxes from the ward would go back to the ward committee, and it is the ward committee that would decide how that money is to be utilized. So that whole issue of financial inclusion, so that when they pay, the money goes to the center, then some to state, and hardly anything comes to the city governments. So this is a new experiment that we are trying, what we learned from the Kerala experiment, where 40% of the plan expenditure goes straight away to local bodies. And there was phenomenal growth also in that. So let us try that. But the whole point is, and this is, I always say, don't treat the city governments as the Swedish government was treating Indian parents. Hey, you don't know how to rear a child. We know how to rear a child. Maybe, and if we don't know, the people will throw us out. Wait for the time. Let no other organization take that domain.
Thank you. Oji, do you want to say something about how that chimes with your findings?
With your findings?
With your findings of people being perhaps less engaged.
I guess we don't know as much about what the representatives know, but my sense is that so all I can say is that one, that when we provide information to them, which is something we try to do about the toilets, for example, you don't see a great interest in that. So very little interest in the information. So we were trying to feed them information. Here's a toilet, here's a set of toilets in Delhi, they don't work. And they were just trying to feed them the information, go fix it. We have very mundane ambitions, which is, let's get the toilets fixed. We gave them a list of toilets, and they weren't that interested. We would deliver the list, and after 5 days, the list has not yet been opened. So there was not a huge amount of interest in this, and it's not. So that's point number one. Point number two is that I think on the other side, I think the fact that you had to fix electricity is part of the problem. So I think people see the whole, all the representatives in Delhi, your MP, your MLA, your councillor, are all liable for everything. because essentially nobody delivers, so everybody is on the firing line. I'm going to go to you. If you don't deliver, I'll go to him. If he doesn't deliver, I'll go to him. And everybody's on the firing line for everything. We haven't managed to convey a sense of, here's my specific responsibility. I can do it. I have the competence to do it. And I don't have the competence to do it. That's something that we absolutely have not communicated.
Okay, a quick response, and then I'd like to turn to Sue.
I think that's where the solution lies. What you require is empowering your local governments. Unfortunately, that has not been done in India. Do it, I'm saying. Let the results fall, maybe say 5 years, 10 years, and then let us review the entire exercise. Because after all, the first answerability is of the local government. Empower them with whatever the 74th Constitutional Amendment states, with whatever. I have so many anecdotes to share, but I know, because we have that paucity of time. Let us empower them, and let's see the results. Because we have not empowered them, and we've seen the results. So let us work the other way around.
Thank you. So, Sue, you threw down quite a provocative gauntlet to the morning session, which talked about governance and government being two sides of the same coin. And you talked about the tyranny of governance. Is it about a pendulum swing going too far one way and then too far another? Or is this a fractured coin that is never going to be repaired?
Thanks, Joe. I'm not sure it's either. And I think part of the difficulty is whether you're talking about government or governance. There are multiple conversations that happen within them. And I think if we reflect on the conversation that happens here, for me it's helpful to try and distill what those different elements are. And what I mean, I don't know if you can imagine a cocktail with sort of 3 parts to it. Where there's that sort of heavy orange bottom, and then a kind of middle bit which is a bit lighter, and then another color. They're all the same drink, right? And I think this is true of both government and governance. And for me, the baseline is really the question that Dunu raised, which is the normative base. What is this thing actually trying to achieve? Is it trying to achieve inclusivity? Is it trying to achieve redistribution? Is it trying to achieve something other than a growth agenda? And that really, we've got to resolve that first and foremost. And that's a civic question, it's a political question, but it is absolutely an expectation of government. And that's what we vote about, or that's what we should vote about. But then there's a whole set of other kinds of issues, which are, for me, the heart of the drink, that middle section. And I think that's where the technology questions come in. And for me, they're much less about the technology which individuals use on their phones and other forms. But when we talk about the urban, there are things for me about, like, what engineering standards do we use? Which package do we use to manage the fiscal system? And maybe in governance terms, there are technology questions which are being challenged at the moment. But it's for me, it's summed up in this question of sort of what's the size and shape of civil society? Who gets to speak? And in government, it's about what the relative powers are. And those come together, I think, in that top layer. And we get confused if we only focus on the interchange between councillors and citizens. Because in a way, what we charge councillors with is the fulcrum of everything else. Now, we may want to think about whether that's the best design. In other words, is a 3 or 4 year electoral cycle the kinds of questions that you have to handle? Is that reasonable to be expecting politicians to undertake, given everything that is so complicated underneath it? And I think, for me, whether we talk about government or governance, both that analogy of those layers is helpful to distill. Otherwise, we try and take on too much.
Great. Dunu, we've talked about a number of dichotomies between government and civil society. Bureaucracy and politics, I think, has been part of the discussion. And you talked about cities as engines of growth and accumulation and extraction. I wonder if you'd like to reflect further on that or other aspects of the conversation so far.
I think we're talking at 2 different levels. One is the level of the economic system, and the other is what the political system is supposed to do. Let me put it this way. Abhijit asked the question, why doesn't the political system face the pressure to improve slums? And he thinks that it is because the politicians want to line their pockets. Now, that's only part of it. The real part of it is that if those slums got what they're asking for, and it's not that they're not asking for anything, water, sanitation, garbage, very clearly up on the agenda. But the moment they are given water, sanitation, and garbage removal, they will also be given entitlement to land. And that is what the economic system does not want to do, because land is the only commodity that urban local bodies have. They want to vacate that land, they want to take it over from the poor as soon as the poor have developed it adequately, and then sell it to the property dealer and the corporation and the developer. So given this economic system, to try and look at it then through the lens of inclusion is, to my mind, the wrong thing.
Sorry,
it has to be.
Are you saying that water, sanitation, providing for these things legitimizes?
It legitimizes tenure.
Yeah.
And then they can demand entitlement. This they don't want to do because they want to kick them around. That is the birth of the informal system, because the informal system is far more extractive than the formal.
Yeah.
Can I just make a comment?
A quick one, yeah.
Yeah. I 100%, I just 100% support what Professor Dunuroy is saying. We've had an experience, actually, we are in the process of shifting one of the tax bases. Earlier we had annual rateable value, now we're moving on to a unit area method. Can you believe who are the front runners to pay the tax? Those staying in the slums.
Yeah.
They're the front runners. Why? Because psychologically it gives them the legitimacy. Hey, I'm paying the tax. I have the right to stay here. Perfect.
Thank you.
I mean, one reason why we emphasize toilets and garbage is that the only two sectors in which the slum dwellers' rights are fully recognized. Partly because of Supreme Court action, those are the only two places. Water is not. They don't have a right to water, actually, or they have a very improperly defined right to water. They have some right to water, but it's by tanker, not direct water flow. Sanitation and garbage are two sanctioned rights, and even those they don't get. So I do think that even there's something beyond what there's a clear recognition in every document and that these are two things that they're supposed to get. Now, I understand that there are other things going on, but I think that water is quite different. And there, I think what you have in mind is very directly true. You talk to the municipal corporation here, they'll say, if we give them water, then there's what's left. How can we move them? And I think water is key in that. I would say garbage and sanitation are less so.
Okay.
Can I just add one short comment to that? Very short. Don't glare at me all the time. Hello?
I'm not glaring, but we must open this up. Okay.
Hello?
Very short.
Very short. No, the reason water is different from sanitation and garbage is very simple. It's hygienism.
Yeah.
Sanitation and garbage does not just influence the slum. The middle-class colonies around are scared to death. They think those guys shitting on the road are going to impact our health. That's why they'll give them some sanitation. They'll try and remove their garbage, essentially because it is not the garbage of the slum. The slum is the home to the waste picker. It's the rest of the city's garbage that is coming there to be segregated, sorted out as part of the larger informal economy.
Thank you. Now, I think Professor Banerjee is going to take over the session and take some questions and comments from the floor.
There are roving microphones. We'll start with the lady in the... Yeah.
I wanted to know what is the experience of other cities in dealing with homelessness, because it took a struggle of 15 years in Delhi to get the government to recognize that there are people living on the streets, and I'm not talking about slum dwellers. And this is a paradox because without homeless people, 95% of whom are working people who segregate waste, who are headload workers, our cities would collapse. And therefore, my question is, why is migration, why is there an adversarial policy environment with regard to migration? Why is the migrant not celebrated, including that low-skilled migrant who sustains cities? And finally, what is the experience really from around the world, especially for India, where we do not have a social security mechanism for homeless people? The other question is also that...
I think you're allowed one question. Thank you. Let's take one question. Sorry. Yeah. We'll take that question and one from here.
Thank you very much. I'm Manoj Tevatia from Chandigarh. My question is related to the theme. Actually, probably some of us have not even touched the theme, inclusive governance. And particularly in Indian context, when we talk inclusive governance, we talk about ward committees, we talk about neighborhood groups and other participation of different stakeholders in the governance. But probably in Indian context, we talk about resources and other things, but we have not talked about these community structures and role of different type of stakeholders. In some of the studies, we have found that the local governments are on receiving end.
Sorry,
the state governments are controlling, and particularly in hilly towns, situation is worst. I recently studied Srinagar, where
sorry, can you pose a question? It'll be really interesting to hear the findings of your study, but if you have a specific question, please pose it.
It's not only question, but I think
it's a bigger discussion, I understand.
So I think we should also look at social dimensions. Now, these exclusive systems are moving from rural areas to urban areas.
Yeah.
I have studied some slums where you find those excluded groups. They were excluded in rural areas as well as they are excluded in urban areas. And city governments or state governments are not making any efforts to include them in decision-making or in housing programs and any other schemes.
Thank you. I think, did you have a question there? We'll take the gentleman in the blue shirt, and then I'll come back. We'll just do those two, and then we'll come back to this.
Thank you. I just have a question. It was said here that the average years the slum dwellers had been there was 17 years. That would suggest that slum growth or new slums have almost stopped, which would be, I mean, in these last 15 years when India has had such very high economic growth rates, one would expect that there is migration to cities has been much bigger. So maybe, if the slums are not growing very much, it's either because government has some fantastic housing policies that is solving the housing issue, or else because maybe the police controls, the way to control land and to keep squatters or other users from taking over land is more effective, so new slums are avoided. But then the problem may be even worse because the poorest people, where are they going to live? So my question is,
Enrique,
what's happening?
Enrique, just to start, tomorrow we have a whole session on land.
Okay, so then we'll leave it for tomorrow.
Let's not grab that space, I think. Anna.
Okay, this gentleman here. One second.
I'm from New Delhi. The theme of the session this afternoon was probably governance versus this exclusion. Does the panel agree with me that tackling exclusion only through the governance angle is a very, very narrow vision? Unless you enlarge the vision, make it political issue, make it a social issue, economic issue you did mention later on. It is an opportunity issue. Unless you have that holistic view, probably a governance measure will alone not solve this problem. It is a systemic result, and a systemic remedy has to be found out.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll take one more question, and then we'll come back for some responses. Yes, I've got you next round. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Anna Herhausen. I have a question to the panel, and that is the following. We've heard quite a bit now about governance, levels of government. And my question is, what is the experience, leaving kind of the structure of government aside, but thinking more in terms of outcomes for the people who are actually being governed? And are we, whichever level it may be, is it thinking about things like, for example, the number of functioning toilets or other indicators at that granular a level? What is the experience we have with that?
Okay, so I think there are three themes that seem to have come up in these questions. One is the issue of homelessness, migration, people coming to the cities. We're not going to go into the discussion of land because we have a whole session tomorrow. The second set of issues is about governance and inclusion and whether governance captures the lived condition. That's been raised in a number of ways. And then this issue of accountability and performance of governments. So our outcomes, do we have any measures by which governments are assessed, or their knowledge of what is not working assessed? And there, I think, so who would like to start? Austin, yeah, and then Sue.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to the last question, because I think it does really cut at an important both analytical and political point. Focusing in on maybe Sue's cocktail, again, just to use that metaphor, but a sort of middle level of governing and state practice, where whatever's happening kind of on this sort of top level or this bottom level, and I think Gerald Frug already brought up in the morning the way in which that kind of bottom-up, top-down kind of dichotomy is often misleading. What you see, really, when you look at things on the ground, the way any kind of housing policy, any environmental regulation, any transportation plan or resettlement project, is you see lots of people doing the work of the state, doing the work of governing in neighborhoods, going house to house, from infrastructure to infrastructure, actually producing the infrastructure on which the city is based. And I think that it's not just an analytical point, but there's a very great deal of actually political work being done there. So regardless of sort of how, and of course it's an important question of how you think about government and its structures and its institutions and how decisions are made and who decides who gets to make decisions. But even when you have different forms of decision-making happening on that level, often you see different kinds of outcomes in these sorts of any kind of sort of governing or state project, and that's because there's a whole set of people actually doing this work of governance, and we've heard very little about those people and what they do and what their politics are and their technical expertise, and there's a ton of what happens in cities that happens at that level, and the whole sort of governance structures and the sort of bottom-up community involvement just leaves that whole sector of what actually produces the urban and its sort of politics and its techniques out of the conversation.
Great. Sue, you wanted to come, and then Abhijit.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I mean, I think that this question, essentially what I was trying to argue is that you will not get inclusive cities until you have a capable state that is able to deliver to its citizenry, all of its citizenry. I would actually go further than that, though, and argue, and it relates to the question about outcomes. And I want to, in your mind, go back to Ricky's graph about where India lay on the ecological footprints and on the social questions. And it seems to me that there's a much bigger question about how we would measure inclusive urban governance. And it's really important that we do that at this moment, because we have the Sustainable Development Goals being set at the moment, the targets being set at the moment. And the question for me is not just so much how to achieve an inclusive city in Delhi or in Kampala, but how does our global system ensure that the kinds of cities we have are inclusive in particular kinds of ways? And that's a very different kind of governance question that I think we might want to think about as well.
Okay, I've just been told we have about 2 or 3 minutes, and I'd quite like to take these 2 questions on the side. So I'm sorry, I don't think I can come back to you, but Abhijit, you wanted to respond very quickly first?
I think that I think part of the reason, I don't want to sound too down on the politicians, and part of the reason it's challenging is just in Delhi, every council has 40,000 people. 40,000 people is a hell of a lot, I mean, and so, you sort of start by thinking, can I make a difference to all these people? And it's pretty easy to give up. So part of what we need is devolution to a much smaller unit, all through the country.
Kind of what, no, not now. And these 2 questions only, I'm afraid. And there is a lady on the right, so if you can do yours in 30 seconds, I can pass the microphone that way. But first, Jagan. Where's the microphone? Yeah, quick. Please.
I'll be very quick. I am terrified with the galaxy of people here, but a person like Mr. Tejendra Singh Pawar has made me think out of the box. I think the time has now come with the leadership at the top that should be an exception, we should demand for it, and I think what you want, power to deliver, will be wonderful. I keep going to USA, and I think that's the right thing. You know, this is the person responsible, and if
Thank you.
do something
That's a
like
good
that,
positive message. Thanks.
A quick question to Sue. Is there still scope for us to recover what might be one of the key outcomes, which is the individual's rights and individual liberties and self-fulfillment of individuals, because the discourse has become so rooted now in communities, and communities can be oppressive as well. And perhaps one of the key outcomes of democracy and cities was to create individuals. And this is crucial in the Indian context because we're talking about entrepreneurship. We're trying to create a new generation of leaders. Leaders are not necessarily communities, they're individuals. And is there scope for that?
Okay, we'll take one question from the lady on the right. Very quickly, please. And
a quick question to cities. We've been talking about how cities are relatively powerless, but streets are under cities' purview in almost every city. And yet, none of our streets in India are equitable. They have no footpaths. They have no footpaths, cities, and they are very much a part of cities' responsibility. Second, if they do not have, if they think they do not have the money, parking is a big issue. And parking can be a win-win situation. If parking is charged, not only do you reduce the inequitable space allocated to parking, but that money could be used for making footpaths. So why is it that cities aren't making footpaths and charging parking and reducing parking?
I think Dunu's answered that question already before. I think we'll just give all our, I'm so sorry, I don't think we'll be able to fit another question in. We're going to give our 3 speakers 30 seconds each if you want to say anything in response. Yeah. Well, everybody
just
now.
very quick to what can I have Mr. Manoj, who I think this is what I whispered in Professor Dunu's ear also, that it's the exclusion is not just economic in India, but it's also social when we speak about Dalits. And I remember in Simla when we were putting up a colony under the BSUP, Basic Service for Urban Poor, it took us 3 full years because the people there never wanted the Dalits to settle there. So that's a real serious issue. They didn't want. I mean, so there's a social. So what we require is, I think what was raised from here, it's a political social movement. I've never said that it's only this, I said strengthening the urban government doesn't mean that is the panacea for all ills. What we require is a social political movement. That can be an answer. Or else, because last that I want to say is, when I met Nimsh, who was the mayor of Bonn, he, for the Mayor's Congress, he said, where are we leading? He said, for the first time in Bonn, we have people under the name of pirates winning. And I was trying to draw an analogy in India, that's all.
Thank you. Does anyone else? You don't have to speak, but you can.
No chance. You hear me? I'll be loud enough anyway. I just want to quote the governor of the Reserve Bank of India, who has said, this doesn't work either.
No, it's works.
Who has said that moving people from rural areas to urban areas increases productivity by 4. And that's growth. And the second point is the 74th Amendment. It seems to offer a lollipop saying only if everybody comes together, then governance will change. Unlikely, unless, as Sue says, this coalition, these people who come together under the 74th, are able to reclaim the state and say the state must deliver.
Yeah, I'd just like to reflect that I'm a little bit wary of the language of inclusion. I think it smacks unhealthily of our own benevolence in inviting the poor to the table. I believe in direct action. I believe in people taking matters into their own hands. And, you know, there is something on the table. There is Transparent Chennai, which is a program by way of which slum dwellers in Chennai have used open source technologies to document the conditions of insanitary conditions in their own neighborhoods and bring effective leverage against the state. Bring effective demands against their counselors, document those results, and publicize them with efficient impact. So, we have a test case of people taking matters into their own hands and using technology, available technology, efficaciously, effectively, brilliantly, inspiringly, the women of the slums themselves. So, I would just ask that when we speak of inclusion, we remember that there's a flip side to it as well, people taking matters into their own hands and doing so with all the wisdom and tools available to them. Thank you.
Okay. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is essentially a highly individual understanding of rights. And I'm not sure that in the urban form and in the urban practice that the individual is necessarily the only site at which rights should be exercised. And certainly not that only living individuals should be the beneficiaries of rights. And I think if we begin to think like that, in other words, what does our articulation of a right to the city imply for future individuals, it helps us deal with some of those other more collective dimensions of rights, including questions of environmental rights and entitlements, which are implied by the modes of urban living that we adopt here.
Thank you all. I think what we have had is some conceptual opening up of thinking of governance and government, and some hard data about the people who are engaging with these governments. And what seems to have emerged is that in this uncertainty of the urban, the popular participation is very high. I mean, if you're looking at all the Indian examples, people are engaging with the political systems, they're holding it accountable. There is a huge amount of political capacity, as some people have started to call it, an understanding of rights and various kinds of claim making. But really the deficit seems to be, much to the frustration of people in the political establishment who want to make a change, the deficit is really in the government side and structures. Thank you all.